The night Jerusalem fell was not just the collapse of stone walls, but the shattering of thousands of hearts. The city once called the dwelling place of God became a smoldering ruin under Babylon's crushing power. Families were torn apart as soldiers dragged survivors into long lines of captives. Mothers wept for children ripped from their arms while fathers walked in silence, their dignity crushed under chains. Among them was a young priest named Ezekiel, carrying not just the weight of his body, but the broken dreams of a life once promised to the service of the temple. He had been trained to offer sacrifices to keep the holy order, yet now the temple lay in ruins. Before we embark on this captivating journey, we would love your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, share this video with others, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our latest stories. For had not the people been called God's own? How could the chosen ones end up as captives, mocked by idol-worshipping conquerors? By the river Sheber, the exiles built their makeshift homes, if they could be called that. The once proud citizens of Jerusalem now squatted in mud huts, their songs of worship replaced by sighs of despair. The river that flowed through Babylon was meant to be a lifeline, yet it only mocked them with its reminder of distance. Every ripple whispered of Zion, of altars they would never see again, of a God who seemed unbearably silent. Ezekiel wandered among the people, listening to their laments. Their voices carried grief but also confusion. Was this punishment, abandonment, or the final end of their covenant story? The young priest's heart was heavy with questions he could not answer. The God he was trained to represent now felt beyond reach, hidden behind clouds of wrath and silence. Days turned to months and months to years. The rhythms of captivity dulled their spirits, and many began to blend into the culture of Babylon, surrendering to despair. Some laughed bitterly at the memory of Jerusalem, mocking their own hope as a dream too fragile to live again. Others clenched their fists, whispering vengeance, but powerless to act. Ezekiel himself lived in the tension between faith and frustration. His priestly calling felt suspended in midair, a role with no temple, no altar, no sacrifice. Every morning he rose to the same dull, landscaped, dusty streets, the cries of children, the groans of men who no longer believed in tomorrow. Night brought no relief, only memories of a city lost to fire. The silence of heaven grew heavier with each passing day. It pressed upon the exiles like an invisible weight, suffocating their will to endure. In his prayers, Ezekiel often found himself speaking into emptiness. The God who once thundered on Sinai now seemed as distant as the stars. Still, he could not abandon the sacred call burning in his chest. Something within him longed for a word, a vision, a spark that could break the darkness. Then came the day that forever changed him. The sky above Babylon did what no one expected. It opened. It began with a storm cloud rolling in from the north, thick with fire and dazzling light. The air trembled, and the ground seemed to shake beneath their feet. Ezekiel lifted his eyes and froze in terror. Out of the storm emerged living creatures, unlike anything seen on earth. They glowed like burning metal, with faces that shifted like the turning of the wind. Their wings beat with a sound like rushing waters, and their bodies were covered with eyes that saw in every direction. Wheels within wheels spun beside them, moving in perfect harmony without turning. Wherever the creatures went, the wheels followed, as if guided by a hidden hand. Above them stretched a vast expanse, sparkling like crystal. It radiated a glory that made human strength melt like wax before fire. And there, above the expanse, was a throne of sapphire. Upon it sat a figure blazing with brilliance, clothed in fire, surrounded by a rainbow of radiant light. Ezekiel collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by the weight of what he saw. This was no distant deity, no silent observer. This was the glory of the Lord. The silence that had crushed him shattered in an instant. Heaven had not abandoned its people. Its king still reigned in unfathomable splendor. By the river Sheber, among captives who thought themselves forgotten, God chose to reveal his throne. The glory of heaven descended not in a palace, but in the dust of exile. Ezekiel's despair turned into trembling awe. The God of Israel was not bound to a ruined temple. His throne moved wherever he willed. For the first time, Ezekiel understood that captivity was not the end. It was the stage where God would write a new story of power and restoration. The storm of glory had broken through the silence, and a priest without a temple was transformed into a prophet with a voice. From exile's despair, a messenger of heaven was born. Ezekiel would never be the same, and neither would the people who heard him. What began in chains by a foreign river would echo through eternity as the vision of the God who sits enthroned above all nations. Even in exile, the throne of heaven was not far away, and the prophet who saw it carried a message that still shocks the world today. The day began like any other in exile, heavy with the dull rhythm of captivity. Men labored under foreign masters, women fetched water, and children played in the dust, their laughter shadowed by sorrow. Ezekiel walked by the river Sheber, his heart weighed down by silence. He had prayed for years, yet heard nothing but the echo of his own longing. The sky stretched endlessly above Babylon, pale and merciless. No one expected anything but another day of despair. But suddenly the air shifted, thick with a presence unseen. A wind rose from the north, carrying with it a storm unlike any earthly storm. Flashes of fire burst within the rolling cloud, bright as molten metal. The heavens seemed to groan as if some hidden power was tearing through. Ezekiel froze, his body trembling as the ordinary world split apart. It was as if heaven itself was peeling back its veil. Out of the storm came something beyond comprehension. 4 living creatures emerged, blazing with unearthly glory. Their forms were human-like, yet each bore 4 faces. A man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, symbols of strength, dominion, and majesty. Their legs were straight, gleaming like polished bronze. Under their wings stretched hands, moving with swift, impossible precision. Each creature had 4 wings, 2 outstretched, touching one another, and 2 covering their bodies in reverence. The sound of their movement was like the roar of rushing waters. Their faces never turned, for each could see in every direction. Fire darted between them, lightning flashing like the pulse of living flame. Ezekiel's heart pounded in terror. What mortal could endure the sight of such heavenly beings? Beside each creature appeared a wheel, shining like topaz. But these were no ordinary wheels. They were wheels within wheels. They moved in any direction without turning, guided by the spirit of the creatures. And the rims of the wheels were full of eyes, seeing all, missing nothing. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying. The eyes pierced Ezekiel's soul, leaving him naked before their gaze. It was as if creation itself had come alive, spinning with divine intelligence. Every movement echoed the will of the one enthroned above. Above the creatures stretched an expanse, vast and glittering like crystal. It shimmered with a brilliance too pure for earthly sight. The creatures' wings thundered beneath it, their sound shaking the very ground. Ezekiel fell to his knees, undone by the weight of glory. Then a voice came from above the expanse, commanding the creatures. They lowered their wings, and silence filled the air, thick and holy. Ezekiel dared to lift his eyes, and what he saw defied imagination. A throne of sapphire blazed above the expanse, radiant with otherworldly light. Seated upon the throne was a figure like that of a man, yet cloaked in fire and brilliance. From the waist up he gleamed like burning metal. From the waist down he glowed like blazing flame. A rainbow encircled the throne, its colors shimmering in the radiance of glory. It was the sign of mercy within the storm, a reminder of covenant amidst judgment. Ezekiel collapsed, face to the ground, overwhelmed by the vision. He knew he was standing in the presence of the Almighty. This was no distant God, no silent deity forgotten in exile. This was the King of heaven, enthroned above all nations, ruling even in Babylon. The vision struck him with awe and terror. The God of Israel was not bound to a ruined temple. He reigned wherever his throne descended. For the exiles who thought themselves abandoned, this vision was a thunderous declaration. Their God had not left them. His throne moved through the universe with unstoppable power. Ezekiel's calling was sealed in fire that day. The man who saw wheels within wheels would never speak as an ordinary priest again. Every eye on those wheels testified to God's omniscience. Every wing beat declared his majesty. Every flash of fire revealed his consuming holiness. Even now, believers tremble when reading Ezekiel's words. The imagery defies logic, yet it burns with a truth deeper than reason. It reminds us that God is beyond comprehension, yet he chooses to reveal himself. His glory cannot be confined, yet he descends into the dust of exile to meet his people. That vision at the river Sheber still shocks the faithful because it tears open the boundaries of the imaginable. It shows us that heaven is not distant, but violently present, breaking through where despair reigns. Ezekiel saw what no mortal dared imagine, the radiant throne of the living God. And from that moment, his life became the echo of that vision, a voice carrying glory into a broken world. Ezekiel had seen the throne, the fire, and the wheels, yet the vision was only the beginning of his burden. The glory that had shaken his soul now pressed upon him with an assignment he did not want. The voice of God called him by name, cutting through fear and hesitation. Son of man, I send you to a rebellious nation, to a people hardened against my word. The weight of that commission fell heavier than iron chains. It meant speaking truth to those who despised truth, carrying judgment to hearts that loved their own delusion. Ezekiel trembled, for he knew the nature of his people. They mocked holiness, scorned correction, and laughed at warnings until destruction fell. Still, God placed a call upon him with no room for refusal. Do not be afraid of their looks or their words. Speak whether they listen or refuse. Then came the scroll, written on both sides with lamentation, mourning, and woe. Its words burned with sorrow, each line a dagger of judgment. God commanded Ezekiel to eat it, to take the bitterness into himself. With trembling hands he obeyed, tasting what no man had ever tasted before. The scroll was sweet on his tongue, yet heavy in his belly. Sweet because it was God's truth, bitter because it condemned the very people he loved. The act made him one with the message. No longer was he a priest without a temple. He was now a prophet whose very body carried God's words. But prophecy did not come wrapped in comfort. God commanded Ezekiel to act out signs that would shock the captives around him. He lay on his side for hundreds of days, symbolizing the years of Israel's sin. His body became a living prophecy of their rebellion. He cooked his food over dung, demonstrating the defilement of exile. The exiles laughed, mocked, and sneered, calling him mad. He shaved his head and beard, dividing the hair into thirds. One part burned, another struck with a sword, and the last scattered in the wind, each piece a picture of judgment. The people stared at him with ridicule, unable to see the storm that awaited them. They dismissed his acts as foolish theater, blind to the warnings etched into every gesture. Loneliness became his closest companion. He bore the stares, the insults, the laughter, yet the fire of God's word would not let him stay silent. Every night he lay down weary, asking why obedience demanded such humiliation. Every morning he rose again, compelled to act out whatever God required. His heart ached for his people, yet their rebellion only deepened. They closed their ears, hardened their hearts, and covered their eyes against the truth. The ridicule did not stop the divine voice. Again and again God spoke to him. They are a rebellious house, but they shall know a prophet has been among them. Ezekiel's obedience cut him off from ordinary life. He was not free to grieve, not free to live like others, not even free to speak unless God opened his mouth. When the Lord struck him dumb, silence wrapped around him like chains. Only when the word of God burned within him did his tongue break loose. The burden was heavy, yet the presence of God was stronger. Every strange act, every hard word, every lonely night carried the unseen weight of divine authority. Still, Ezekiel felt the sting of rejection. To be laughed at while carrying heaven's message carved wounds that no man could heal. He watched neighbors whisper about his sanity. Children pointed, wives shook their heads, and men dismissed him as a fool lost in visions. Yet beneath the mockery, a quiet fear stirred. They could not deny the authority that shadowed his every word. For when he spoke, it was as if thunder cracked in their midst. When he moved, it was as though unseen hands directed his steps. God's power upheld him when his strength faltered. In his weakness, he discovered the unshakable strength of divine presence. Though obedience brought pain and ridicule, it also birthed unbreakable resilience. He learned that God's word was not bound by human approval. Every humiliation became a testimony, every insult a reminder that he was set apart. The cost of obedience was high, but the power of God was greater. The reluctant mouthpiece was now a vessel of fire. His life, stripped of comfort, burned as a living witness to heaven's authority. Through him God thundered warnings that no rebellion could silence. Through him divine power confronted human pride. Ezekiel understood that a prophet's path was never easy. It was marked by rejection, yet it pulsed with the unshakable presence of God. And though his voice echoed in a land that mocked his name, his obedience carved a testimony that still burns with glory today. The vision came to Ezekiel like a dagger through the heart. He had seen the throne of God in Babylon, but now he was about to witness something that shook his very soul. He was lifted in spirit to Jerusalem, carried in the hand of God. What he saw made his chest tighten with unbearable grief. The temple, once the dwelling place of God's presence, still stood in its majesty. Yet within its courts, corruption and idolatry had taken root like a spreading disease. Images of crawling creatures and false gods lined the walls. Priests who once bowed in holiness now bowed before idols. Women sat weeping for Tammuz, a pagan deity, while men turned their backs on the sanctuary to worship the sun. Abominations filled the very house built for the Lord's glory. Ezekiel's eyes widened as he saw it, the glory of the Lord beginning to rise. The radiant presence, once settled between the cherubim, now stirred as though ready to depart. It lifted from the mercy seat and moved to the threshold of the temple. A sound like rushing waters filled the courts, but it was not a sound of blessing. It was farewell. The prophet's heart cracked at the sight. To see God leave his own dwelling was a grief deeper than the loss of a city. Angels of judgment appeared, 6 men clothed in linen with weapons in their hands. Another carried a writing kit, awaiting orders from the Most High. God's voice thundered, commanding that those who grieved over sin be marked. The rest were handed over to judgment without mercy. Ezekiel wept as the angels moved through the city, striking down without pity. The blood of rebellion demanded a reckoning, and heaven's agents carried it out. The glory moved further still, ascending from the threshold to the eastern gate. It lingered as though unwilling to leave, yet the sins of the people pushed it away. Ezekiel fell on his face, crying out in agony, "Alas, sovereign Lord, will you completely destroy the remnant of Israel?" His tears stained the ground, his voice breaking with despair. But the judgment could not be halted, for the covenant had been trampled beyond measure. The temple that once blazed with holy fire now echoed with silence. The city itself was consumed by flames as Babylon's armies carried out their siege. Smoke rose to the heavens where glory once descended. For the exiles, news of Jerusalem's destruction was like the final blow to their identity. Their land, their temple, their pride all reduced to ash. And in Ezekiel's vision, the most terrifying truth remained clear. God himself had departed, leaving the holy place an empty shell. It was the darkest spiritual hour in Israel's history. The nation that boasted of divine presence was now bereft of the very one who made them chosen. The silence that followed was suffocating. Without the presence of God, even the temple was just stone and wood. Ezekiel's heart ached with unspoken questions. Could the covenant survive such abandonment? Was exile the final word? Every memory of Jerusalem pierced him like an arrow. The streets once filled with pilgrims now lay in ruins, and the songs of Zion had turned to mourning. The prophet carried the weight of grief not only for himself but for generations unborn. He had seen the departure, and his words would echo the loss forever. Yet even in the vision of doom, a small thread of hope remained. The marked ones, those who mourned sin, were spared as a sign that God had not fully rejected his people. Still, the loss was immeasurable. To live without the glory was to walk in shadows, unsure if the light would ever return. The exile felt heavier now, for they were not only captives of Babylon, but captives of absence. Their God seemed distant, their prayers unanswered. The temple had been their anchor, and now it was gone. The glory had been their shield, and now it had departed. Ezekiel wept as though his own heart had been torn apart. To see God leave was worse than chains, worse than fire, worse than death. He spoke the vision to the people, his voice trembling. Many mocked, but others felt their spirits collapse under the weight of judgment. The question haunted every exile in the days that followed. If God had left his own house, had he left his people forever? Ezekiel wrestled with the same agony, torn between despair and the faint flicker of hope. His visions told him judgment was necessary, yet his heart longed for restoration. The burning of the temple was not just the end of a city. It was the tearing of a covenant, the breaking of a bond that once defined a nation. The silence that followed was worse than Babylon's cruelty. Heaven itself seemed shut, and God's throne far away. Yet even in the silence, Ezekiel held on to the memory of the throne he had once seen above the river. The God who departed the temple was not defeated. He was still enthroned in majesty. And so the question lingered like smoke after fire. Had God abandoned his people? Or was he preparing to reveal his glory in ways they could not yet imagine? Ezekiel was carried in the Spirit to a place unlike any he had seen before. It was not a city, not a battlefield, but a vast valley filled with bones. The ground was littered with skulls, ribs, and fragments of lifeless humanity. The sun beat down on them, bleaching them white, silent witnesses to hopelessness. God led him to walk among them, to see with his own eyes the depth of desolation. Everywhere he looked, there was only death, no trace of breath or blood. The bones were very dry, brittle from years of exposure. They told the story of a people long gone, their future erased by time. As Ezekiel stood in the valley, a voice from heaven pierced the silence. "Son of man, can these bones live?" The question burned like fire in his heart. Reason screamed impossible, but faith whispered that God's power knew no limit. With trembling lips he answered, "Sovereign Lord, only you know." It was a confession of human weakness and divine possibility. Then God gave a shocking command. "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, 'Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord.'" Ezekiel's voice shook as he obeyed. He preached not to men with ears, but to bones that had no hearing. The words of prophecy rolled into the silence, colliding with the stillness of death. What happened next sent shivers through the valley. There came a rattling, faint at first, but rising like thunder. Bones began to move, clattering against one another as if pulled by unseen hands. Ezekiel's eyes widened in awe as skeletons assembled before him. Skulls found spines, ribs clasped together, limbs stretched into place. The valley trembled with the sound of thousands of bones coming to life. Dust rose like smoke, veiling the miracle unfolding. Then tendons appeared, binding the frames with strength. Flesh grew over them, and skin stretched to cover their form. What once was a valley of bones now looked like an army of lifeless bodies. They had shape but no breath, form but no spirit. God spoke again, commanding Ezekiel to call forth the wind. "Prophesy to the breath and say, 'Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe into these slain.'" Ezekiel lifted his voice with trembling reverence. His words echoed across the valley, summoning the very breath of God. Suddenly the air shifted, a wind rushing like a storm through the bones. It filled the lifeless bodies, stirring them from stillness into motion. Eyes opened, lungs expanded, and hearts began to beat. What once was silent death became the sound of life rising. Before Ezekiel stood a vast army, alive and strong. From hopeless bones had risen a multitude ready to march. God's voice explained the vision to the stunned prophet. "These bones are the whole house of Israel, who say, 'Our hope is gone. We are cut off.'" The people in exile felt as lifeless as those bones. They believed their story had ended, their covenant buried forever. But God declared a different ending. I will open your graves and bring you back to the land of Israel. It was not merely about bones. It was about resurrection hope. Death did not have the final word, God did. For a people who thought themselves abandoned, the vision shattered despair. Even in exile, God promised life, restoration, and a future. Ezekiel's tears flowed as he grasped the magnitude of what he saw. The same God who departed the temple was now promising to breathe life again. The vision was not just about Israel. It was a glimpse of God's eternal power. If he could raise dry bones, he could raise nations, lives, and even the dead. Generations later, believers would look back on this valley with trembling hope. They would see in it the foreshadowing of resurrection beyond the grave. The rattling of bones still echoes through history, reminding the hopeless that God restores. The breath that filled that army still points to the Spirit who renews. What Ezekiel saw became one of the most powerful promises in all Scripture. It was proof that God can bring life out of death, hope out of despair, and glory out of ruin. The valley of bones stands as a witness to every broken soul. No matter how dry, how scattered, or how forgotten, God can raise them again. Ezekiel left that vision forever changed, carrying the weight of resurrection hope. His voice became the trumpet that declared God's power to revive his people. And to this day, the story still stirs hearts with awe. For the God who spoke to bones is the same God who speaks life into us now. Ezekiel had seen judgment, destruction, and despair, yet God was not finished with him. Out of the ashes of exile came visions of a future so glorious it defied imagination. The prophet was carried once more in the Spirit, lifted above the ruins of sorrow. Before him stretched a vision of a new temple, radiant with divine presence. Its measurements were perfect, its courts pure, its altars undefiled. It was not a temple of stone only, but a symbol of restoration beyond human hands. From beneath its threshold, Ezekiel saw something astonishing. A trickle of water began to flow eastward, small and unassuming at first. The water grew into a stream, then into a mighty river that could not be crossed. Wherever it flowed, life burst forth in abundance. On its banks grew trees of healing, their leaves vibrant and unfading. Each tree bore fruit every month, nourishment for a world weary of famine. The river reached down into the desert, transforming barren wastelands into gardens. Even the salty waters of the Dead Sea turned fresh, filled with fish in abundance. Ezekiel watched in awe as fishermen spread their nets where no life had been before. The impossible became possible, for God's river carried healing. This was no ordinary stream. It was the living water of God's presence. Its flow promised that no place was too dead for revival. In the vision, Ezekiel heard the promise of a shepherd king. A ruler unlike any other would gather the scattered, heal the broken, and unite the divided. This shepherd was not harsh like the corrupt leaders of the past. He would feed his flock, bind up the injured, and lead them with tender strength. Israel, torn by rebellion and exile, would be restored under his care. Nations that mocked would see a kingdom born, not of war, but of righteousness. Above it all, Ezekiel saw the return of God's glory. The throne that once departed the temple now descended again in radiant majesty. The voice of God declared, "This is the place of my throne, the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among my people forever. The covenant was reborn in blazing fire. The city itself received a new name, no longer Jerusalem, but the Lord is there. Presence replaced absence, glory replaced silence. Ezekiel wept with joy as he grasped the magnitude of what he saw. Exile was not the end, restoration was the destiny of God's people. The glory that once left in sorrow now returned in triumph. The people who thought themselves abandoned were destined to dwell with their King forever. The vision stretched beyond his own generation, reaching into the ages to come. It was a prophecy not just for Israel, but for all creation groaning for renewal. The river symbolized life that only God could give. The throne symbolized power that no empire could overthrow. The shepherd symbolized a ruler whose reign would be eternal. Together they painted the picture of the kingdom of God breaking into human history. Even now the vision shocks believers, for it speaks into our own despair. It reminds us that God is not finished, that his throne still moves, and his river still flows. In a world scarred by war, famine, and division, Ezekiel's prophecy thunders with relevance. It declares that God alone can heal what seems irreparably broken. The temple Ezekiel saw was not just stone and sacrifice. It pointed forward to the dwelling of God with humanity, where his presence would never depart again. The shepherd king points to a Messiah who would lay down his life for his people. In him, scattered hearts find home, and broken souls find restoration. The river still speaks of the Spirit, flowing into deserts of unbelief and turning them into places of life. Wherever it touches, dead things rise again. Ezekiel's story is more than history. It is prophecy breathing into our present. It whispers that what God began in exile, he will complete in glory. The throne above the crystal expanse is not distant. It descends into the world, ruling with justice, mercy, and unshakable power. Ezekiel's final vision leaves us trembling with awe. The God who departed returns not in silence, but in overwhelming majesty. The valley of bones taught that death is not final. The river of life teaches that restoration is eternal. For every heart that feels abandoned, Ezekiel's prophecy is a promise. The King is coming, the river is flowing, and the throne will dwell among us forever. The prophet who once sat by the river Chebar in despair now leaves us with a vision of unending hope. And that vision still calls to us today, commanding us to believe that God's glory is not lost be. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. That's the only way you can help us. Keep telling the truth that saves.